I never imagined that the life of my best friend and her daughter's life would get tangled up with the supernatural in such a dangerous way. My name is Clara, and this is the story of how my best friend Elena fell in love with a creature that shouldn't exist, and how that love changed everything we thought we knew about what it means to truly love someone. It was past midnight when I heard the knocking. Not the polite kind of knocking. The desperate kind. The kind that makes your heart jump before your mind even catches up. I threw on a robe and rushed to the door, already knowing something was terribly wrong. And there she was. Elena, my best friend since we were 7 years old. The girl who used to share her lunch with me in 3rd grade. The woman who held my hand through every heartbreak. The person who knew me better than anyone in this world. But that night, she wasn't the Elena I knew. She was trembling. Not from cold, from something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. In her arms, she held little Leah, her 4-year-old daughter. The child was sleeping, but even in the dim porch light, I could see her face was flushed, burning with fever. Elena's eyes found mine, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. Pure, undiluted terror. But there was something else too. Something that looked almost like wonder, mixed with shame and confusion and a desperate need for help. I didn't ask questions. I just pulled them both inside, locked the door behind us, and led them to the couch. I laid Leah down gently, covered her with a blanket, and pressed my hand to her forehead. She was burning up, her small body radiating heat in a way that made my heart clench with worry. But when I turned to Elena to suggest we take her to the hospital, my friend had collapsed into herself. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, head in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a sick child. This was about something else entirely, something darker, something she'd been hiding from me for months. I sat beside her and waited, because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just be there, to create a safe space where the truth can finally breathe. And after what felt like an eternity, with only the sound of Leah's labored breathing and Elena's quiet crying filling the room, my friend finally spoke. She told me about him, Darian, a name I'd never heard before, a man I'd never seen, a person who, as far as I could tell, didn't exist in any normal sense of the word. She said she'd been seeing him for months, and I hadn't known. Me. Her best friend. The person she told everything to. Or at least, I thought she told me everything. Elena described how they met at a gallery opening on a warm September evening. She'd been standing there for at least 10 minutes, she said, just staring at a painting of a sunset that seemed to bleed across the canvas. It was the end of a particularly hard week. Leah had been sick with a stomach bug. Work had been stressful with a new exhibit opening. Her ex had forgotten to send child support again, leaving her scrambling to cover rent. She felt drained, exhausted, like she was just going through the motions of life without really living. Like she'd become a shell of herself, defined only by her responsibilities and failures, with no room left for the vibrant, creative person she used to be. And then this voice beside her, smooth as silk and rich as velvet, commented that the artist had captured something rare. The precise moment when day surrenders to night, when the world holds its breath between one state and another, when everything is possible because nothing has been decided yet. She turned and saw him for the first time. Darian. She said her first thought was that he was too beautiful to be real, that he looked like he'd stepped out of a period drama or a Renaissance painting. All sharp cheekbones and intense eyes and an elegance that most men spend years trying to cultivate and never quite achieve. He was dressed simply, dark pants that looked expensive but understated, a dark shirt that fit perfectly, a coat that had the weight of quality without being showy. But it was the way he carried himself that struck her, like he'd been alive for centuries, like he'd seen empires rise and fall and learned to move through the world with confidence born of experience rather than arrogance. Which, she later learned, he had. They talked about the painting, about art, about the way certain colors can evoke emotions that words can't capture, about the difference between technique and soul, about how the best art makes you feel something you didn't know you were capable of feeling. Elena said she felt seen in a way she hadn't felt in years, not objectified like so many men made her feel, Not judged for being a single mother or for having stretch marks or for working at a gallery instead of being an artist herself. Just seen. Really, truly seen. Like he was genuinely interested in what she had to say. Not just waiting for his turn to talk or trying to impress her with his knowledge. He asked thoughtful questions about her opinions, made insightful observations that showed he'd really listened, challenged her perspectives without being condescending or dismissive, made her laugh with dry wit that caught her off guard, made her think with observations that were profound without being pretentious. By the time the gallery was closing, she realized they'd been talking for over 2 hours. She'd completely lost track of time, something that never happened to her because she was always hyper-aware of when she needed to get back to Leah, always calculating travel time and babysitter costs, and whether she could afford another 15 minutes of freedom. But Leah was with her grandmother that night, and for the first time in 4 years since becoming a mother, Elena had let herself just exist as Elena. Not as a mother, not as an employee, not as someone's ex-girlfriend or someone's daughter, just as herself, just as a woman who loved art and had interesting thoughts and deserved to be listened to. Darian walked her to her car that night, and before she got in, he asked if he could see her again, not in a pushy way, not with an expectation of yes, just a simple question that gave her the power to choose. She said yes without hesitation, without the usual anxiety that came with dating as a single mother, without the mental calculations of whether this person would be good around her daughter, or if she was wasting her time, or if she should just focus on Leah instead of trying to have a personal life. Just yes, because something about him felt right in a way she couldn't explain and didn't want to question. They exchanged numbers, except Darian never texted, never called, never reached out through any of the normal channels that modern dating required. And for 3 days, Elena thought she'd imagined the connection, that she'd built it up in her head, that he'd just been a beautiful stranger making conversation and she'd read too much into it. Then, 3 nights later, he was outside her apartment when she came home from work, standing in the shadow between streetlights, like he'd been waiting, like he'd known exactly when she'd arrive. Elena said her first instinct should have been fear. Should have been alarm bells and locked doors and a call to the police. A man showing up at her home uninvited should have set off every warning she'd ever been taught about stranger danger and boundaries and safety. But it didn't, because somehow she'd known he would come, had felt him approaching all day, like there was a string connecting them and she could feel when he pulled on his end, like some part of her had been waiting for him without consciously realizing it. They went for a walk that night, through the quiet streets of the city, talking about everything and nothing. He asked about her daughter with genuine interest, asked her name and age, asked what she was like, asked if being a single mother was as hard as everyone said. Actually listened to the answers instead of just asking to seem polite. He asked about her art, whether she still created or if working at a gallery had killed her own creative drive. Asked about her dreams, the ones she'd had before life got complicated. Asked about her favorite artists and why. Asked questions that showed he cared about who she was as a complete person, not just the attractive woman he'd met at a gallery. He listened like every word mattered, like she was the most fascinating person he'd encountered in a very long time. Which, she later learned, maybe she was. Maybe after centuries of existence, finding someone who made you want to listen, really listen, was rare and precious and worth pursuing. By their 3rd meeting, Elena knew something was different about him. It wasn't just his appearance or his intelligence or the way he made her feel. It was something fundamental, something otherworldly. The way he moved, fluid and graceful in a way that seemed almost inhuman. The way he never seemed to get cold, even though it was October and the nights were freezing and she was bundled in a jacket while he wore just a shirt. The way his eyes caught light like an animal's, reflecting it back in a way that human eyes don't. The way he never suggested getting coffee or dinner or any of the normal date activities. Always just walks, long conversations in the darkness. Moments stolen when the sun had set and the world belonged to night. She noticed, but didn't question, not wanting to break the spell of whatever this was. On their 4th meeting, he told her. They were in a park, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, and the moon was full and bright. He said he needed her to know what he was before things went any further, that he cared about her too much to build something on lies, that she deserved honesty even if the truth would drive her away, even if being honest meant losing the first person in 2 centuries who'd made him feel something other than emptiness. Elena said her heart had started pounding before he even said the word. Some part of her had already known, had felt it in the way the air changed around him, in the way other people seemed to unconsciously avoid their path when they walked together, like some primal instinct warned them away. In the way he sometimes looked at her throat with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between hunger and restraint. When he said the word vampire, it should have sounded ridiculous, like a joke or a pickup line or the beginning of some weird fantasy roleplay. But it didn't. It sounded like the truth, like the only explanation that made sense for all the things she'd noticed but couldn't explain, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Elena asked him to prove it, not because she doubted him, but because some part of her brain needed to see it to fully accept it, needed concrete evidence to override years of believing that vampires were fiction, that the supernatural was just stories, that the world operated according to rules she understood. Darian had smiled, sad and knowing, like he'd expected this. Then he moved. One moment he was sitting beside her on the bench. The next he was standing 20 feet away, then across the path, then in a tree above them, then back beside her. All in less than a blink, moving faster than her eyes could track, faster than physics should allow. Then he showed her his fangs, just for a moment, just enough. They descended smoothly, 2 elongated canines that were impossibly sharp and unmistakably real. Not fake costume teeth, not a trick of the light. Real fangs meant for piercing flesh and drinking blood. Elena said she should have run, should have screamed, should have grabbed her phone and called someone, anyone, should have done all the things you're supposed to do when confronted with danger. Instead, she'd asked questions. How old was he? Where was he from? How did he survive? What did he eat? Was he dangerous? Could he die? Did he have a family? Had he loved before? Darian answered everything honestly, his voice steady and patient, like he'd been waiting centuries to have this conversation with someone who might actually understand. He was 374 years old, born in France in 1651, in a small village she'd never heard of that probably didn't exist anymore. Turned against his will at 28 by a vampire who'd become obsessed with him, who'd decided that something as beautiful as Darian shouldn't be allowed to age and die. He'd spent the first century of his immortal life trying to die, trying every method he could think of to end an existence he hadn't asked for, walking into sunlight only to discover it burned but didn't kill fast enough, starving himself only to find that the hunger eventually overrode all rational thought, and he'd wake up covered in someone else's blood with no memory of feeding. Seeking out vampire hunters only to find they didn't really exist, at least not effective ones. The second century he spent learning to accept what he was, learning to control the hunger, learning to feed without killing, learning to exist in a world that had changed dramatically from the one he'd been born into, learning to hide what he was because humans who knew the truth either tried to kill him or exploit him, and neither option led anywhere good. The third century he spent trying to find meaning in an existence that never ended, trying to remember what it was like to be human, trying to hold on to compassion and empathy and the ability to connect with people, trying not to become the monster that his maker had been. He said most vampires eventually became monsters, that the weight of centuries eroded your humanity until you stopped caring, until you stopped seeing humans as people and started seeing them as food or toys or annoyances, until you lost the ability to feel real emotion beyond hunger and boredom and rage. But he'd tried to hold on to his humanity, had made it his mission to remember, to care, to see value in mortal lives even though they flickered and died while he continued. It was harder than anyone who hadn't lived centuries could understand. Every person you cared about died. Every connection you made ended. Every bit of yourself you invested in the mortal world eventually crumbled to dust. Most vampires stopped trying after a few centuries, stopped investing, stopped caring. It hurt too much to love things that died. It was easier to remain detached, to treat existence like a game, to amuse yourself with temporary pleasures and forget that you'd once been capable of feeling something deeper. But Darian had kept trying, kept caring, kept hoping that maybe, someday, he'd find someone who made eternity feel less empty, Someone who reminded him why being alive, even as something not quite human anymore, could matter. And then he'd met Elena. He said he hadn't meant to fall in love, that he'd been so careful for so long, keeping his distance from humans beyond what was necessary for feeding, avoiding attachments, avoiding connections, because he'd learned centuries ago that loving mortals only led to pain. But Elena had been different. Something about her had called to him. The sadness in her eyes that matched his own. The weight she carried that he recognized. The creative soul struggling to express itself under the burden of responsibility. The loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but never truly seen. He'd approached her meaning only to have a brief conversation, to remember what it felt like to connect with a human on an intellectual level. And then she'd smiled, and laughed, and looked at him like he was a person, not a thing to be feared or used. And he'd been lost. Elena told me all of this while looking at her hands, twisting them together in her lap, like she was ashamed, like she expected me to judge her for falling for a vampire story, for believing in something that sounded like it came from a paranormal romance novel, for risking her life and her daughter's safety for a relationship that couldn't possibly work. But I didn't judge her, because I could hear the truth in her voice. This wasn't some fantasy she'd invented. This wasn't delusion or desperation or a clever man playing on her vulnerabilities. This was real. As impossible as it sounded, as dangerous as it clearly was, it was real. And she loved him. That's what made it so complicated. If she'd just been under some kind of supernatural spell, we could have found a way to break it. If he'd been manipulating her or controlling her mind with vampire powers, we could have fought that. But this was genuine love. The kind that makes you want to be better. The kind that sees all your flaws and chooses you anyway. The kind that's willing to be patient and compromise and work through impossible logistics. She said the feeding started after they'd been seeing each other for about a month. She'd noticed Darian getting weaker as time went on. Saw it in the way he moved. In the shadows under his eyes that grew darker. In the way he had to focus to keep his fangs from descending when he looked at her. In the way his hands sometimes trembled when they got too close. One night, he told her he needed to feed soon. That he'd been putting it off because he didn't want her to see that side of him. Didn't want her to be afraid. Didn't want to shatter the illusion that he could be something other than a predator. But he was getting to the point where he wouldn't be able to control himself much longer. Where his instincts would override his intentions and he might hurt her without meaning to. Elena said she'd made the offer before he could ask. Told him to feed from her. Said she wanted to help. Wanted to understand this part of him. Wanted to be useful instead of just a complication in his existence. Darian had refused at first. Said it was too dangerous. Too intimate. Too likely to create a bond that would be hard to break if things didn't work out between them. He explained that feeding created a connection between vampire and donor. That she would crave it afterwards. Would feel drawn to him in ways that went beyond normal human attraction. Would struggle to separate genuine feelings from the supernatural bond. He didn't want to trap her like that. Didn't want their relationship to be built on a supernatural bond, rather than genuine feelings. Didn't want her to stay with him because she was addicted to being fed from, rather than because she actually wanted to be with him. But Elena had insisted. Said she was already addicted to him anyway. Already couldn't imagine her life without him in it. Already felt a connection that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with finally finding someone who understood her. She wanted to understand him fully. Wanted to experience what he experienced. Wanted to be connected to him in every way possible. So he'd agreed, but with rules. Strict rules that he made her repeat back to him to ensure she understood. He would never take more than she could safely give. Would always stop before she was in danger. Would always ask permission first. Would never feed from her in front of Leah or anyone else. Would never let it become something she depended on to feel loved or wanted. Would never use it as leverage or control. It would be an act of intimacy. Yes, something private and meaningful between them, but not the foundation of their relationship. Not the reason they were together. Just one aspect of a complex, key, real love that existed independent of blood and fangs and supernatural bonds. The first time he bit her, Elena said it was the most intense experience of her life. More intense than childbirth. More intense than any drug she'd ever tried. More intense than the best sex she'd ever had. More intense than anything she'd thought possible for a human body to feel. Painful at first, like every nerve ending was on fire. Like her entire body was rejecting this intrusion. Like she was dying. Then, as his venom entered her bloodstream, the pain transformed into something else. Something euphoric. Like she was floating. Like every endorphin in her body had been released at once. Like she'd discovered a new dimension of sensation that normal humans never experienced. But more than the physical sensation, she felt him. Felt his hunger, sharp and ancient and overwhelming. Felt his need, not just for blood but for connection. Felt his centuries of loneliness like a weight pressing down on her soul. Felt how much he cared about her. How hard he was trying to be gentle. How terrified he was of hurting her. How much this moment meant to him. And in that connection, she felt more understood than she'd ever felt in her human relationships. It was like he could see directly into her soul, could see all her fears and insecurities and broken pieces, could see the parts of herself she kept hidden from everyone else, and he loved what he saw there. Loved her not, despite her flaws but including them. Loved the whole messy, complicated, real version of her that she never showed anyone. The feeding became a regular part of their relationship after that. Once a week at first, then twice if he was particularly weak or if they'd gone a few extra days without seeing each other. Always consensual, always carefully measured. Always followed by hours of him holding her while her body recovered, whispering apologies and endearments and promises that he would never take more than she could give. But it was taking a toll that Elena tried to hide at first. From me, from her co-workers, from her mother, from herself. She told herself she was just tired from work and single parenting, that the weight loss was from stress and forgetting to eat, that the pallor was from not getting enough sun because she was spending all her free time with Darian after dark, that the constant exhaustion was just her body adjusting to a new routine. But deep down, she knew. She was dying. Slowly, incrementally, but dying nonetheless. Her body couldn't keep up with the constant loss of blood, couldn't replenish fast enough between feedings, couldn't maintain the balance between what was being taken and what her body could produce. And Darian, despite his best efforts and genuine care, was draining her, not intentionally, not maliciously. But the simple mathematics of a vampire feeding regularly from the same human meant that human would eventually run out, like a well being drawn from faster than it could refill. Eventually, it would run dry. She'd tried to talk to him about it, suggested he feed from others to give her body time to recover between sessions. But Darian said he couldn't. That once a vampire began feeding regularly from someone they loved, feeding from others became nearly impossible. The blood tasted wrong, felt wrong, like cheating on a partner or betraying a trust. It would be like asking her to kiss other people because kissing him was somehow harmful. The intimacy of feeding made it exclusive. And breaking that exclusivity would mean ending their relationship because he couldn't be with her while feeding from others. It would destroy what they had. It would make their connection feel cheap and transactional instead of meaningful and intimate. So they were stuck, loving each other in a way that was literally killing her. Unable to be together without harm, but unable to be apart without heartbreak. Caught between impossible choices with no good options, just variations of pain and loss. That's where things stood when she showed up at my door that night, exhausted beyond measure. Weak to the point where caring for her sick daughter had become difficult. Terrified of dying and leaving Leah motherless. Terrified of what would happen if she kept going like this. Terrified of losing Darian if she stopped. Terrified of all the impossible choices in front of her. But also desperately in love with someone she couldn't have without sacrificing her life. Still craving his presence. Still wanting him with an intensity that frightened her. Still believing that what they had was worth fighting for even if she didn't know how. I listened to all of this in stunned silence, my mind racing to process information that shouldn't be possible. My best friend was in love with a vampire. Real vampires existed. The supernatural was real. Everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. And the person I cared about most was slowly dying because of a love that transcended species but couldn't transcend biology. Part of me wanted to grab Elena by the shoulders and shake her, to tell her to wake up, to see what he was doing to her, even if unintentionally, to run as far and fast as she could, To choose her daughter, choose her life, choose survival over this impossible romance. To never see this creature again no matter how much it hurt. But I could see it in her eyes as she talked about him. This wasn't manipulation or mind control or addiction to being fed from, though those elements existed. This was genuine love. Real, deep, soul-level love. The kind that comes around maybe once in a lifetime if you're lucky. The kind that poets write about and people spend their whole lives searching for. The kind that makes you understand why people do crazy things. She loved him in a way I'd never heard her talk about anyone. Not Leah's father. Not any of the men she'd dated over the years. Not even her art, which had been her greatest passion before Leah was born. This was different, deeper, more fundamental. Like he'd become part of her soul and removing him would leave a wound that never healed. So instead of telling her what to do, instead of judging or lecturing or trying to make her see reason, I asked her what she wanted, not what she should want according to logic or safety or social expectations, not what would make everyone else happy, not what was sensible or responsible. What did she, Elena, truly want in her heart? If she could have anything, if there were no obstacles or consequences, what would she choose? She looked at Leah sleeping on the couch, her small chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Then she looked at me with eyes full of tears and fear and desperate hope, and she said she wanted both. She wanted to be Leah's mother, to watch her grow up, to be there for every milestone and every challenge. She wanted to raise her daughter and be the kind of present, loving parent she'd always dreamed of being. And she wanted Darian, wanted the connection they shared, wanted to explore what their love could become, wanted to be with someone who made her feel alive and seen and valued, wanted this relationship that had brought color back into her gray world. She wanted the impossible, wanted to have everything when the universe said she had to choose. And I understood then that my job wasn't to judge her or fix her or convince her to make the sensible choice. My job was to help her find a way to have both, if such a way existed, to help her navigate this impossible situation, to be the friend she needed while she figured out how to love a vampire without dying, and how to be a mother while her heart belonged to an immortal being. We started with the immediate crisis, getting Leah's fever down with medicine and cool compresses, making sure Elena ate something, even though she had no appetite, creating a stable foundation before we tried to solve impossible problems. And slowly, as dawn approached and light began creeping through the windows, Leah's fever broke. The little girl woke up groggy but better, crawling into her mother's lap. And Elena held her with a fierceness that told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities truly lay. She would never abandon this child, not for anyone. Not even for a vampire she loved with everything in her. Leah would always come first. Always. That was non-negotiable. But that didn't mean she didn't want Darian, too. Didn't mean the love wasn't real. Didn't mean finding a solution wasn't worth pursuing. It just meant that whatever solution we found, it had to center Leah's needs, had to protect this innocent child who didn't ask to be part of a supernatural drama. As Leah dozed contentedly in her mother's arms, I asked Elena the hard questions, the practical ones she'd been avoiding while caught up in the intensity of her relationship. What did Darian really want from this? What was his endgame? Did he expect Elena to turn eventually and become like him? Did he understand that she had a daughter who needed her for at least another decade and a half? Was he willing to be part of their lives in a way that didn't require Elena to sacrifice everything? Elena said they'd talked about all of it. Multiple long conversations about the future and what it could look like. Darian knew about Leah, obviously. Had known from the beginning that Elena was a mother. He'd never met the little girl. Elena had been careful about that, protecting her daughter from a world she wasn't ready to understand. But Darian knew she existed and that she was Elena's first priority. He'd told Elena he understood that she was a mother first, that Leah would always come before him, that he would never ask her to choose between them because forcing that choice would make him the monster he'd spent centuries trying not to be. He said he was willing to wait. To let Elena live her human life, raise her daughter, be there for all the moments that mattered. And then, when Leah was grown and independent and living her own life, when Elena had fulfilled her obligations as a mother, if she still wanted him, if she still wanted immortality and the love he offered, he would turn her. They would have eternity together then, centuries to explore their connection, time unlimited to be together. But not now. Not at the cost of Leah's childhood. Not at the price of Elena's humanity during these crucial years when her daughter needed a mother. It sounded too good to be true, and I said so. I'd seen enough romance movies and read enough books to know that supernatural beings making promises about the future rarely followed through. That vampires were supposed to be possessive and controlling, that the offer seemed too generous to be real. What was the catch? What wasn't Elena telling me? She smiled sadly and said the catch was obvious. Darian was asking her to trust him for decades, to believe that he would wait while she aged and changed and lived a human life without him, to have faith that when the time came, decades from now, his offer would still stand, that he wouldn't get tired of waiting, wouldn't find someone else, wouldn't change his mind about turning her. And there was the other catch, the one Elena barely wanted to voice. Could she even make it decades without him? Could she go back to normal human life after experiencing what they had? Could she give up the feeding, the connection, the intensity of their relationship, and be content with ordinary existence? Could she trust herself to not go back to him before it was safe? Before Leah was grown? Most importantly, could she survive stopping now? She was so weak already, so drained. What if stepping back killed her faster than continuing would? What if trying to quit cold turkey put her in the hospital? How would she explain that to doctors? How would she care for Leah if she collapsed? Those were the real questions, the impossible calculations, and neither Elena nor I had good answers. We just sat there as the sun rose, holding a sleeping child between us, contemplating choices that all led to pain in different flavors, trying to find a path through darkness that seemed absolute. That's when I made my decision. I told Elena that she needed to stop seeing Darian for a while, not forever. Not as a breakup, but as a break. A pause. A chance for her body to recover and her mind to clear. She needed to get healthy again. To focus on Leah. To remember what her human life felt like without the constant pull of the supernatural. She needed to prove to herself that she could survive without him. That her love for him wasn't just an addiction to the euphoria of being fed from. That it was real and would endure even without the physical connection. And if, after she was healthy and strong and clear-headed, she still wanted him, then we would figure out a way to make it work. A way that didn't require her to slowly waste away. A way that honored both her love for Darian and her responsibility to Leah. Elena started crying, but they were tears of relief. Like she'd been waiting for someone to give her permission to step back. To choose survival without feeling like she was betraying her love. To breathe without feeling guilty about it. She asked me if I thought Darian would wait, if I thought their love could survive months or years of separation, if I thought she was making the right choice or the worst mistake of her life. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I'd never dealt with vampire romance before and had no expertise to offer. But I knew this. If Darian really loved her, not just the blood she provided or the company she offered, but really loved her as a person, he would understand. He would give her the space she needed. He would respect her choice to prioritize her daughter and her health, and he would be there when the time was right, if that time ever came. If he wasn't willing to do that, if he pushed or manipulated or tried to make her feel guilty for choosing survival, then he didn't deserve her. Vampire or not, immortal or not, supernatural connection or not. Love that demands you destroy yourself isn't love. It's possession, and Elena deserved better than that. Then Elena asked me to do something I never expected. She asked me to talk to Darian, to explain her decision, to make him understand why she needed distance, because she didn't trust herself to see him without falling back into the pattern, without giving in to the craving, without letting him convince her that they could make it work somehow. She needed someone else to be her voice, someone who could stand firm even in the face of centuries-old persuasion and supernatural charisma, someone who cared about her enough to protect her even from herself, someone he would have to listen to because refusing would prove he never really cared about her well-being. I didn't want to do it. The thought of facing a vampire terrified me on a primal level, but this was Elena, my best friend, the person I'd known and loved for most of my life, the woman I'd seen through heartbreak and disappointment and every challenge life threw at her. I would do anything for her, even face down a creature of the night, even risk my own safety, even have the hardest conversation of my life with someone who could kill me without effort. So I said yes. That evening, after Elena and Leah had fallen asleep in my guest room, exhausted from the emotional ordeal and the physical recovery, I went to the gallery where Elena and Darian had first met. I didn't know if he would be there, but I had a feeling he would know I was coming. That he would sense my connection to Elena through whatever mystical bond they shared. That he would be curious about the human who Elena trusted with her darkest secret. The walk through empty streets felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a different world where normal rules didn't apply. The city looked the same, but felt different, charged with possibility and danger. I kept my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over emergency contacts, even though I knew police couldn't help with vampires. It just made me feel marginally less vulnerable. The gallery was closed, lights off, but the door was unlocked when I tried it, like he'd left it open as an invitation or a trap. I pushed it open slowly, every horror movie I'd ever seen flashing through my mind, warning me not to go inside, not to confront the monster alone, not to put myself in danger for someone else's choice. But I went in anyway. For Elena. Always for Elena. Inside, the space was dark except for strategic spotlights highlighting certain pieces. The artwork looked different at night, more dramatic and alive, like the paintings were breathing in the darkness. And there he was, standing in front of the same painting where he and Elena had met, the bleeding sunset that had started everything. Darian. My first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct I had screamed that I was prey in the presence of a predator, that I'd made a terrible mistake coming here alone, that I was about to become a cautionary tale about humans who interfered in vampire business. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline flooding my system, preparing me for flight even as I forced myself to stay. But I forced my feet to remain planted, forced myself to take a breath, forced myself to remember why I was here. For Elena, for Leah, for the family I'd chosen even if we weren't related by blood. I could do this. I had to do this. Even I could see why Elena had fallen for him. He was beautiful in a way that transcended normal human attractiveness. Tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of elegant bearing that spoke of generations of aristocracy or centuries of practice, with features that looked carved from marble by a master sculptor who understood beauty on a fundamental level. Dark hair that fell perfectly around a face that could have belonged to a Baroque painting. High cheekbones that caught the light, a jawline that could cut glass, lips that were somehow both sensual and cruel, capable of kisses or killing with equal facility. He looked young, maybe late 20s, frozen at the peak of physical beauty. But there was something ancient in the way he held himself, something that spoke of centuries lived and countless experiences weathered. Something that made my instincts scream that this was not human, would never be human again, could not be trusted. He was wearing dark clothing that looked expensive, but understated. Pants that were tailored perfectly. A shirt that probably cost more than my monthly rent. A coat that had the weight of quality without being ostentatious. But it was the way he carried himself that truly struck me. Like he'd been alive for centuries. Like he'd seen empires rise and fall. Like he'd learned to move through the world with confidence born of experience rather than arrogance. He didn't turn to look at me when I entered, just kept staring at the painting, hands clasped behind his back in a pose that could have been contemplative or threatening depending on how you looked at it. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet, smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. French, maybe, though centuries had softened it into something unique. He asked if Elena had sent me to end things. There was no surprise in his voice, no anger or defensiveness, just a deep, aching sadness that made him sound ancient and weary, like he'd been expecting this conversation, preparing for it, like he'd known from the beginning that loving a human would end in loss because it always did, because mortals always chose survival over impossible love, and they were right to do so. I found my voice, though it came out shakier than I would have liked. Showing weakness in front of a predator seemed unwise. But I pushed through anyway. I said no. She hadn't sent me to end things. She'd sent me to explain. to help him understand why she needed distance, why loving him was killing her, why she couldn't choose between him and her daughter, why she needed time and space and a chance to recover before she could even think about what came next. He finally turned to face me, and I understood in that moment, viscerally and completely, why Elena had fallen so hard and so fast. It wasn't just his physical beauty, though that was undeniable and almost overwhelming. It was the weight of emotion in those ancient eyes. Pain, loneliness, love, regret, hope, despair. All of it laid bare for me to see without any attempt to hide or minimize. Vampires, I realized with a shock, didn't hide their emotions the way humans did. They'd lived too long to bother with masks and social niceties. They felt things intensely, and showed it because pretending otherwise was exhausting when you had centuries stretching ahead of you. And right now, looking at me with those impossibly expressive eyes, Darian was in pain. Real, genuine, soul-deep pain that made my heart ache despite my fear. He took a step toward me, and I forced myself not to step back. Forced myself to hold my ground even though every instinct screamed to run. He smiled slightly at my obvious attempt at bravery, and there was something almost fond in that smile, like he appreciated the courage it took for me to stand there. Then he gestured to a bench near the painting, an invitation to sit, to talk like civilized beings instead of predator and prey, to have a conversation instead of a confrontation. I sat, keeping space between us but trying not to look terrified, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. Darian settled beside me, keeping a respectful distance, not crowding me or trying to use proximity as intimidation, just existing in the same space, giving me the option to stay or go, making it clear that this was a conversation, not a threat. He said he knew, that he'd been watching her fade for months, watching her struggle, watching her try to balance two worlds that couldn't coexist in the way they'd hoped. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke, and I had to remind myself this ancient creature had lived for nearly 4 centuries, who'd probably seen empires rise and fall, who'd survived wars and plagues and every kind of human atrocity, who had centuries of experience that should have made him hard and callous, and yet he was breaking over a single human woman he couldn't have. He said he'd been a fool to think it could work, that he'd been selfish to even try, that he should have walked away the moment he realized he was falling in love with her. Because vampires and humans weren't meant to build lives together, not while the humans still had responsibilities to the mortal world. Not while there were children involved, not when the very act of loving each other was slowly ending one of their lives. I sat there listening, watching this ancient being struggle with emotions I wouldn't have thought vampires capable of, and I asked him the question that had been bothering me. Why did he start this if he knew it would end badly? Why pursue Elena if he understood the incompatibility? Why set them both up for heartbreak? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands, these hands that had lived for centuries, that had created art and ended lives, and held the people he loved as they died. These hands that had touched Elena with such tenderness. These hands that were killing her by degrees even as they tried to show love. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. He said he hadn't meant to fall in love, that he'd been so careful for so long, keeping his distance from humans beyond what was necessary for feeding, avoiding attachments, avoiding connections, because he'd learned centuries ago that loving mortals only led to pain. You watch them age while you remain unchanged. Watch them wither while you stay forever young. Watch them die while you continue endlessly. It was easier not to love at all. Safer to remain detached. Simpler to view humans as interesting but temporary, like beautiful butterflies that lived for a season and then were gone. Most vampires learned this lesson early and never forgot it. Love was weakness. Attachment was pain. Better to remain alone than to suffer the inevitable loss that came with caring. But Elena had been different. He'd seen her at the gallery opening, standing in front of that painting, and something about her had called to him in a way nothing had in decades. The sadness in her eyes that matched his own, the weight she carried despite being so young, the creative soul struggling to express itself under the burden of responsibility. the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but never truly seen or understood. He'd approached her meaning only to have a brief conversation, to remember what it felt like to connect with a human on an intellectual level, something he rarely did anymore. And then she'd smiled, and laughed, and looked at him like he was a person, not a monster or a curiosity, like his thoughts mattered, like his opinions had value, like his presence was wanted rather than feared or tolerated, and he'd been lost, completely, utterly lost. All his careful defenses crumbled in the face of her genuine interest and engagement. All his centuries of practiced detachment melted away. All his resolutions to remain alone dissolved like mist in sunlight. He tried to stay away after that first night, told himself it was madness to pursue this, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. About the way she talked about art with such passion, like it was a living thing that mattered. About the love in her voice when she mentioned her daughter, unconditional and fierce. About the loneliness that mirrored his own, making him feel less alone in his immortal existence. About the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone who could understand him. So he went back, told himself he would just check on her, make sure she was okay, not complicate her life. But then he saw her struggling with groceries while trying to keep her daughter from running into traffic, and he'd helped. Made the little girl laugh with a silly face, carried packages, walked them home. And Elena had thanked him and asked if he wanted to get coffee sometime. He'd said yes, even though every instinct told him it was dangerous, that humans and vampires didn't get happy endings, that this would only end in pain for both of them. He said yes because for the first time in 200 years, he'd felt something other than emptiness. He'd felt hope. And hope, even false hope, was precious enough to risk everything for. Darian looked at me with those ancient, pain-filled eyes and said that one coffee became 2 meetings, 2 became regular dates became something deeper. And by the time he realized how far in he was, how much she'd come to mean to him, it was too late. He loved her, completely, irrevocably, in a way that made 3 centuries of loneliness seem worth it if it led to her. But love wasn't enough. It had never been enough when immortals loved mortals, because the fundamental math didn't work. His nature required feeding. Feeding required blood. Taking blood regularly from the same person led to their death, slow and inevitable. There was no way around that harsh biological reality. Unless Elena turned, but he couldn't ask her to do that without making himself exactly the kind of monster he'd spent centuries trying not to be. Couldn't ask her to abandon her humanity, her daughter, her whole life for him. Couldn't ask her to become something she wasn't ready to become. Couldn't force that choice. So he was trapped, loving someone he couldn't keep without destroying them. Unable to leave because his heart wouldn't let him. Watching her fade, knowing he was the cause. Hating himself for being selfish enough to start this while simultaneously unable to imagine existence without her now that he'd found her. He told me all of this while staring at his hands, and I saw something that shocked me. Resignation mixed with determination. He'd already decided what he was going to do before I arrived, had known what had to happen, was just waiting for someone to make it official. I asked him what he wanted, what outcome he was hoping for from this conversation, what he expected me to say or do. He looked at me then, and I saw something profound in those ancient eyes. Not hope, not anger, just a deep, abiding love mixed with the certainty of loss. He said he wanted Elena to be happy, to be healthy, to be strong, to raise her daughter and live her life without the shadow of the supernatural hanging over her, to have the normal human experience she deserved, to grow old and have grandchildren and create art and find joy in ordinary things. And if that meant living without him, then that's what needed to happen, even though every instinct in his immortal being screamed against it. Even though letting her go was the hardest thing he'd done in his long existence. Even though it would probably destroy what remained of his humanity, because losing her might finally be the thing that made him stop caring altogether. He would do it. Because that's what you do when you really love someone. Not the possessive, controlling love that demands and takes, but the real love that gives and sacrifices. You give them the space they need. You respect their choices even when it kills you. You want their happiness more than you want their presence. You let go, even when holding on is all you want to do. I felt tears welling in my eyes because I was sitting across from a vampire, a creature I'd been taught my whole life was evil and monstrous. And he was showing me more selfless love than I'd seen in most human relationships, more genuine care than most men showed their partners, more willingness to sacrifice than most people were capable of. He asked me to take care of her, to make sure she got healthy again, strong enough to reclaim her life, to help her remember what it felt like to live without constantly being drained, without supernatural complications, to be the friend she needed while she healed from this impossible love, to remind her that she was worthy and valuable and deserving of happiness. And I promised I would, because that's what friends do. Because Elena deserved all of that and more. Because someone had to protect her when she couldn't protect herself. Then Darian did something that surprised me completely. He stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the gallery, his movements as fluid and graceful as water. He pulled out a small wooden box that looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum. Inside was a crystal vial, no bigger than my thumb, filled with dark red liquid that caught the light like garnets. His blood. He held it out to me carefully, reverently, like he was offering something sacred. He said if Elena ever got sick, really sick, if she ever needed healing beyond what modern medicine could provide, if there was ever an emergency with Leah that required supernatural intervention, she could use this. One drop would heal almost any wound, cure almost any illness, save a life that was slipping away, pull someone back from the edge of death. It was powerful, potent, dangerous in the wrong hands but life-saving in the right ones, and he was giving it to us freely. It was a gift with no strings attached, no expectations, no demands, just a way of protecting the woman he loved and her daughter even from a distance. Even after walking away, even knowing she might use it and never think of him again. Even knowing this might be the last thing he ever gave her. I took the vial carefully, handling it like the precious gift it was. The glass was cool against my palm, and I could feel the weight of what it represented. Protection, safety, a piece of him that would remain even after he was gone. One last way to keep them safe. I asked him why. Why would he give this to us? Why would he help Elena even after she'd chosen to leave him? Why be so generous when he was the one suffering? It didn't make sense in the world as I understood it. He smiled then, and for the first time since I'd entered the gallery, there was genuine warmth in that smile. A glimpse of the man he must have been before he was turned. Before centuries of existence had worn away most human softness. Before he learned that immortality was more curse than blessing. There was kindness in that smile, and gentleness, and a deep well of love. He said that love doesn't stop just because the relationship ends. That he would love Elena for the rest of his existence, whether he ever saw her again or not, whether she thought of him fondly or wanted to forget him entirely. That he would carry her in his heart for centuries, maybe forever, because she'd given him something precious. She'd reminded him what it felt like to care, what it meant to love, what made existence worth enduring even when it was painful. And if he couldn't be with her, if their love wasn't sustainable in practical terms, the least he could do was make sure she and her daughter were protected, that nothing would harm them that his blood could prevent, that they would be safe even if he couldn't be the one keeping them safe directly. He said I was a good friend, that Elena was lucky to have me, that he understood why she'd chosen to confide in me rather than face him herself, that he could see I would protect her fiercely, even from him if necessary, that my love for her, though different from his, was just as real and perhaps more sustainable. There was no bitterness in his voice when he said this, no jealousy or resentment, just acceptance, just love that asked for nothing in return, just profound sadness mixed with genuine care for Elena's well-being. Then he walked back to the painting, our conversation clearly over. A dismissal, but a gentle one. I stood to leave, the vial warm in my hand now, pulsing slightly like it had a heartbeat of its own. At the door, I turned back. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was seeing his pain. Maybe it was recognizing real love when I saw it. Maybe it was just knowing that Elena would want me to say this. I told him that she loved him too, that whatever she decided, however this ended, He should know that what they had was real, that she would probably love him for the rest of her life, even if they could never be together again. That he had been seen and known and loved by her in a way that transcended species and mortality, and that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Maybe knowing you were truly loved once was worth all the pain that came after. Darian didn't turn around, but I saw his shoulders tighten, saw the way his hand clenched at his side, saw the barely perceptible tremor that ran through his frame. And I knew he'd heard me, knew the words had landed, knew I'd given him something he needed even if it hurt. I left the gallery with the vial in my pocket and tears streaming down my face, because I'd just witnessed something I never expected to see. A vampire capable of genuine, selfless love. A creature who was willing to let go of the person he loved most because it was what was best for her. Who gave up his own happiness for hers without hesitation. Who loved her enough to walk away. Who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go. And I understood then that Elena's love for him wasn't misguided or foolish or the result of supernatural manipulation. It was real. As real as any love I'd ever witnessed. Maybe more real than most human love because it had faced the impossible and chosen sacrifice over destruction. Chosen life over possession. Chosen love that let go over love that held on too tight and strangled. That was the beginning of the hardest months of both our lives.